Next month, my co-host Dalia Shandlin is joining an array of experts for a weekend of talks and debate on the Middle East. The event takes place in Weston Park, a magnificent stately home in the UK, between the 23rd and 25th of March. Other speakers include the New York Times Tehran correspondent Thomas Erdbrink and Nicholas Blandford, the Beirut-based journalist. The event is being organised by the UK travel company Political Tours. Stay tuned for more details about the event at the end of this podcast.
This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Wiener Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dalia Shandlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and things that we consider essential. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a subscriber by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find the link on the Tel Aviv Review website and in the show summary on your podcast app. Any and all amounts help. Our guest today is Leon Wiener Dow. He's a research fellow and a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and we'll be talking about his book, The Going, A Meditation on Jewish Law. It is a fairly self-explanatory title, but we'll be asking about the role of Jewish law in religious life and maybe even a non-religious life. It was published by Palgrave, and I want to welcome Leon Wiener Dow to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
The book deals largely with the relationship between a number of components, as I see it. It's kind of this dance between God, law, prayer, practice, and community, all within the context of Jewish law. Was your goal to sort of try and juxtapose all these things together and say this is how they fit together or how they're woven together?
My goal was to give the most authentic and exhaustive, without being exhausting, treatment of Jewish law that I could. That is to say, I wanted someone who doesn't come from the realm of Jewish practice to be able to read The Going and have some sense of what it's about. And I wanted someone who does, who's used to living in that world, to have that kind of experience that we sometimes have when someone comes and visits us in our familiar territory, and we take them around and suddenly we see things in a way that we hadn't seen before because there's someone visiting and because we're looking at things through their eyes. So I wanted to give some explanation of what the Halakha, what Jewish law is about. That's really what I was after. And in order to do that, all of those constituent components that you discuss come into play. That's also why there's a strong autobiographical element. This wasn't meant, there is a way in which it functions, or at least the first chapter functions as a kind of spiritual biography, but that's not at all what I was after. What I was after was to get to the Halakha, but there was no way for me to do that without avoiding, so to speak, my own approach to and my own coming into that world from outside of it.
And would you say that this book is directed to any particular audience? Are you hoping that religious people will sort of see Jewish law in a new way with a new guide? Or are you also hoping that secular people will say, I never thought of Jewish law this way. Maybe there's a role for this in my life?
The answer is yes. That is to say both. And I'll add, I think that there's a third audience, which is people who don't come from the Jewish tradition.
Like all of our listeners.
Yes,
many
exactly,
listeners. Yes.
Exactly. So I think that it's interesting when the time came to look for a publisher. One of the questions that publishers ask is they want a list of books that are like this, and it was very hard for me to provide that to any of the publishers. And the only book that comes even remotely close to doing what I try to do in terms of the treatment of halakha is probably Halakhic Man by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. But it's such a very, very, very different take on halakha and an attempt to describe what Jewish law is, that it's not tantamount. So my attempt was really to try to describe the halakha for people both within and without, and that includes Jews and non-Jews.
And how do you do it practically? I mean, were there any passages or paragraphs that you wrote and then said, oh, that might be too self-evident for the familiar reader, or some, the opposite, that might be too distant or opaque for the unfamiliar reader?
So that's an excellent question. The answer is that the first thing that I did, and I remember this day very vividly, I was a postdoctoral fellow at Berkeley Law, And this was my project. This was the pitch that I had given them that I was going to do. And I remember that first day when I was sitting across from a blank computer screen and starting at ground zero and was frightened because I really didn't know how to begin the process. Once I was in the process, and ironically enough, the process was difficult because I had just finished writing a doctorate in Hebrew, and so suddenly writing in English, my native language, was very difficult for me.
Tell me about it.
But what ended up happening as being the most effective way to deal with the kinds of issues that you're addressing was to send it to readers, certain readers. So certain readers, I was very deliberate about which readers I showed it to, and there were certain kinds of readers that I showed it to in its manuscript form, and getting feedback for them was very, very significant. I was somewhat apprehensive about how those who are well-versed within Jewish law would experience it, and I've been very, very pleasantly surprised by the feedback that I've gotten.
Do they too see it as some sort of educational endeavor?
I'm not sure educational is the right word. A couple of colleagues that I sent it to who were very well-versed in the area of Jewish law, their unsolicited reaction, it was solicited insofar as I asked them their reaction, but what I meant to say is they did not at all need to be complimentary, was that a lot of the readings that I offered were kind of eye-opening for them and caused them to look at things in a different way. Obviously, that I have no guarantee that will be the experience of all readers or many readers, but I hope that it will.
And it's interesting that you say that you don't think anything quite like this has been done before, and I'm sure that's correct in terms of a book devoted to this topic. But I do see it. It reminded me of a bit of maybe you can even say a genre of writing that, at least in my associative thinking, had to do with people like Irving Greenberg and Heschel himself, and of course David Hartman. I mean, there's these kind of thoughtful journeys through Jewish tradition, law, spirituality that are different from academic texts and different from, it's kind of a way of writing. Do you see yourself as part of that tradition?
Yeah, I in contrast to the book that I wrote in Hebrew, which came out from Bar Ilan University Press, which is clearly an academic book. The first draft of this book, I literally wrote with no footnotes. I decided everything that's important. I will tie my hands behind my back, literally, and not allow myself that temptation of essentially allowing the reader to have bifurcated attention, where there's a text and then there's words underneath that text which are going to somehow complement or add to that text. I wanted everything to be in the text. In that sense, yes, it's in the tradition of Jewish thinkers, and I like to think of it, or I want to think of it, as a work of Jewish thought and not a work, not a critical work, not a work of academic appraisal of some kind of Jewish idea. But insofar as it's different, I don't think that, except for maybe David Hartman in the introduction to his book, A Living Covenant, where he mentions some biographical statements, or maybe his last book, The God Who Hates Lies, which had a very strong autobiographical element, but I would say that's something that he allowed himself at the very end of his life. Except for those two elements, both Heschel and Greenberg and Hartman really don't bring the experiential and biographical element into their writings. And that, I think, makes it somewhat exceptional.
Well, why is it important to bring in this autobiographical element into it? I thought there's this famous Israeli poem, L'chol echad Yerushalayim. Everyone has his or her own Jerusalem, right? And I think with Halakha, it's kind of the same, right? Everyone has his own personal engagement with Halakha. What did you think that your personal story would bring to the table?
But just to give a little counterpoint, of course, it's not everybody's own Halakha, because Halakha is so much a part of community, as you devote a whole chapter on the meaning of Halakha community. So it's a little bit of...
So y'all are having exactly the kind of conversation that I think needs to be had.
Did you just say y'all? You're from Houston, aren't you?
I'm from Houston. I'm from Houston. Y'all are standing on that tension. That is to say, there is, and that's what I try, that's one of the things that I try to get across, that there is an irreducibly personal element, an undeniably existential element in anyone's halachic practice or understanding. There are deep, deep conversations with the divine which someone is playing out in their lived life through their praxis. But there's also a very clear call and demand that the community makes, a demand of conformity. Certainly from the outside, it looks like rigidity. And therefore, that's one of the things that I want to get across is that irresolvable tension. And in that sense, the reason, getting back to your question, Gilad, the reason that I needed to bring that biographical element, I would say, is two. Number one, from the perspective of the halakha and from people who look at it, I think that there's a kind of optical illusion, which is that precisely because people tend to see the Shulchan Aruch and the communal demand and the demand for uniformity, the assumption is that there is not a kind of deep and demanding inner religious life that a person brings to the area of observance. It's just conformity. And in that sense, that's a kind of optical illusion from the outside that I wanted to correct. There's another aspect which I was after, which is that I think that one's religious life and philosophical life and commitment to ideas cannot be separated from one's experience. That's a philosophical position that I have. The person who I spent my doctorate on was Franz Rosenzweig, and he has this great line where he says, "Of course, I can only view things from my own eyes. I would not have any better vision if I were to poke out my own eyes in order to get at some objective vision of things." That is to say, there's a way in which the world as I understand it, the world as I interact with it, is undeniably my experience of the world and my interaction with the world. That's not to say that it's subjective. It's to say that it's intersubjective between the world and me.
I like that quote a lot, and I'm going to now
So
use
now
it
I'm going
all
to have
the
to
time.
get you the proper quote.
That's okay, we'll look it
but that's also perhaps a good segue into my next question, which is about the two biggest influences that stand out in the book. You quote quite a few sources of inspiration, but I think that one is David Hartman and another is Franz Rosenzweig.
Yes.
If this is a fair
You're
characterization.
You're right, and they did not get along. That is to say, Rabbi Hartman did not like
Precisely.
Rosenzweig.
And also, their own biographical trajectory is also markedly different from each other's and from yours.
Yes.
So I'm trying to understand how, this love triangle,
Good.
Leon
Good.
Wiener Dow,
Right.
David Hartman, and Franz Rosenzweig.
So with Rosenzweig,
where do they
with
interact?
Rosenzweig, you have to be very careful when you say love triangle because he had a protracted affair with his best friend's wife, which makes it very difficult.
Right.
Yes, ouchie. So what I can say is the following. My interest in Rosenzweig came my junior year in college when I had the fortune of taking a class with Professor Robert Gibbs, he was then at Princeton, is now at Toronto. And he introduced me to Rosenzweig as well as Buber and a French Catholic theologian named Gabriel Marçal. And what Rosenzweig did for me then was I had been consumed with Nietzsche's attack on values and was pretty convinced that Nietzsche was right. And Rosenzweig philosophically gave me an answer to Nietzsche. That was, which I won't go into now, but that was my first interest in Rosenzweig, and it was a strong interest which pulled me in. And my interest in Rosenzweig was very, very protracted. I did my master's in Rosenzweig at the Hebrew University, and then I decided that's enough. Rosenzweig got ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, and spent the last 6 years of his life in bed. His paralysis set in, and what any reader of The Star knows, The Star of Redemption is his famous work, is that it begins with the words out of death and out of the fear of death, begins all philosophizing, and then it ends with into life. And it's obviously those are the cornerstones, and Rosenzweig is trying to move from a certain philosophical perspective, which he thinks is an attempt to avoid death and which paralyzes as a result of that and leads you into life. That's what he's trying to do. But Rosenzweig's own biography is that he was struck by paralysis a month after he finished a manuscript, not The Star, but a manuscript called The Little Book on Common Sense, in which he tells a story. Since no one understood The Star of Redemption, his publishers asked him to please write something that was accessible, more accessible. And he wrote this little book, and it tells the story of someone who is paralyzed by philosophy. And his thinking, called the New Thinking, comes and is the healing process for that person. A month after he finished that manuscript, and he put it in a drawer and did not publish it. One of his students published it after he was already dead. A month after he finished that manuscript, his first signs of paralysis struck in. So my somewhat midrashic reading on Rosenzweig, although I really think that it's true, is that he was paralyzed. He was not able to escape from philosophy. His biography is a very, very significant part of who he was as a thinker and as a Jew as well. He grew up in an assimilated Jewish home and almost converted, and then found his way back to Judaism only because he decided that if he was going to leave Judaism, he had to learn more about it before he left. So that was my interest in Rosenzweig. My interest in Rabbi Hartman was somewhat... I first met him my first year in Israel, and I was I was enthralled by him, and as a teacher and as a person and as a thinker. And after a few different interactions with him as a teacher, he also conducted my wife's and my chuppah. He did our wedding. And then later, when I was at a very critical juncture, I'd finished my master's and I had had enough of Rosenzweig, and I was trying to decide whether I wanted to get a doctorate or pursue rabbinic ordination somewhere. He invited me to learn with him. He was not a fan of Rosenzweig. He did not like existential philosophy. And I can only share that someone, and I don't want to mention him by name because maybe he wouldn't be happy about it, but another scholar at the Hartman Institute, one of the senior scholars, said that he only recently discovered Rosenzweig, and he regretted the fact that Rabbi Hartman so disliked Rosenzweig that he had really kind of overlooked him or not really paid enough attention to him. I personally think that Rosenzweig has, both philosophically and theologically, a lot to teach us.
Well, it's interesting that in your book you actually, I didn't know this was from Rosenzweig, but there's a portion, I can't remember which chapter it is, where you talk about how that we are living life under the shadow of death all the time, and we are every day one step. I think maybe it's the chapter on time, is that right?
That's right, that's right.
How's that influenced by this thinking?
That's exactly right. That is to say, one of the things that is very, very influential for me about Rosenzweig's thought is an awareness, and here he's very close to Heidegger, the sense that our lived lives are inexorably drawing nearer to death. And we have moments of awareness, right? That's why Kohelet Ecclesiastes says it's better to go to Beit HaEvel mi Beit HaMishte. It's better to go to comfort mourners than it is to go to a party. Why? Because we get in touch with something very real and very raw about life, which along our way we often forget about, because we get caught up in stresses or we get caught up in things that aren't quite so important. And there's a way in which that grounds us and brings us back to that awareness, and suddenly we say, okay, I'm going to do things differently now. Rosenzweig lived with a very, very clear death consciousness, which maybe made it difficult to be by him, around him. But I think that there's a way in which, if one is honest about one's life and you do an accounting about what I do, why do I do what I do? Why is it important for me to get this book published? Why is it important for me to have children? What is the motivation? In a lot of the things that we do, I think a lot of what motivates us are quiet and sometimes not explicit or acknowledged bouting with death.
Who doesn't acknowledge it? I think about it every day. I want to ask you about the role of law. I mean, really, the book is about the role of law. And there's an interesting, it's just a little sentence in there. But you talk about the importance of law as part of Jewish community and community in general. And then you have this little one-paragraph takedown of the kibbutz movement where you imply...
I expected someone to come with... Yeah.
Where you imply... it sounds to me like you're implying...
Dalia is a former kibbutznik, we should say in full disclosure.
Well, for a year and a bit of my life. But it was an important part of my life.
Yeah.
So we'll put aside the pronouncement of a total failure of the kibbutz movement, because I could argue that too. I mean, it played a role. But anyway, you say the ideology wasn't sufficient because it was missing law, custom, and living. But that sounds like you're essentially saying it failed because it was too secular in a way. Is that how you characterize it?
No, law can be secular. Part of what I was after, well, first of all, here I have to put my biographical background on my sleeve, which is I come from a long legacy of lawyers. My grandfather was a lawyer. My father is a lawyer. 3 of my 4 brothers are trained as lawyers. You're
talking to the daughter of a lawyer and a judge.
So
I'm not sure if this is about our biographies.
No, but so I don't at all mean to suggest that law has to be religious. In fact, just the opposite is the case. I think that one of the major challenges of halakha, and I've done some work in the area, a lot of scholars of halakha spend a lot of effort trying to say, hey, this is law too, in contemporary jurisprudence discussions. So if anything, maybe it's those who are talking about halakha need to assert that it's law even though it's religious. What I was after is that there is a way in which there are established communal norms, whether they are made explicit as laws or they're implicit as communal norms, and how decisions are made and how one's life is lived, and regulations that the community, the the sovereign, if it's, the state, or if it's the kibbutz, exercises its control over the individual and those members of its community. I think that there's a way in which, and this is what I was after in terms of my critique of the kibbutz, is that there wasn't enough attention paid to the fact that the law expresses, and this, gets back to Robert Cover's famous essay about nomos and narrative, about the interaction between law and the narrative that animates the law. But I think that the kibbutz movement and I would say secular Judaism in Israel doesn't sufficiently recognize the importance of law. That is to say, and that was Bialik's famous call to the flag in his essay Halakha ve'Agadah. He really wanted people from that community to say, hey, it's not just Agadah, it's not just narrative that's important, law is also important. And law, I would even say it this way, and this is what I try to say in the context of halakha, law speaks. Law allows values to be spoken out. So there's a way in which lots of times we think, just Agadah, just fable, just narrative tells a story and talks values. No, that's not true. If we look back at our lives, a lot of what we understand about our values, we really understand by looking at what are the decisions that I've made? Who's the person that I've decided to live my life with? Where are the places that I've decided to live? What are the actions that I fill my day with? And if I look at my lived life, my quote-unquote laws, so to speak, the norms in which I've acted out, there's a lot of way in which I can work backwards and understand what are the values that are really animating me.
I have to challenge you on this still,
Okay.
because you're describing them as if they didn't have law. Whereas, of course, they were subject to the sovereign laws of the state of Israel. And, of course, they had their own norms. And, kibbutz life has its own norms. In fact, I think many former kibbuznikim would say that there were too many constraints, unspoken, unwritten. So when you say there wasn't enough law, what you're saying is that secular state law wasn't enough, and the kibbutz secular life with its own norms wasn't enough. So what's missing? It sounds like you're implying by not saying it that religious something was missing. No?
No. I mean,
Okay.
what I would say about that is that I think that there's a way, and I won't say some of my best friends are kibbutznikim, but I have. But
I mean, let's say kibbutz could be a stand-in for any secular society, which is really what I'm getting at.
Well, what I would call the kibbutz is more of a community than a society. I mean, there's obviously a way in which the network of kibbutzim provides a kind of society or constitutes a kind of society. But I'm thinking of the kibbutz, the individual kibbutz, more as a community than as a society. And in that sense, yeah, of course, obviously every kibbutz had, its laws of assembly and who's allowed to get permission to go to the university or go traveling or whatever. But there's a way in which I think that the attempt to distance itself from Jewish law, precisely because of the religious tenor of the law, made the kibbutz movement underestimate the importance of its mores, its laws and customs. And that could include the way that it was doing Shavuot and bringing Bikurim and making it, but it's much more than that, of course.
But then what does that say
brings-
about secular society in general? You're saying there's no hope for community in secular Jewish Israeli society?
Of course I'm not saying that. I think that I've spent the last decade, 11 years, I taught at the Yeshiva Chilunit Shel Bina, the Bina secular yeshiva
You're
in Tel
a
Aviv.
Bina person.
I'm a Bina
Uh-huh.
person, and it was with great sorrow that I said goodbye there, just because at Hartman they wanted more of my time, and I couldn't split myself. I would never say such a thing, and that's even just a hard thought in my estimation. What I would say is that any community, whether it's secular or religious, needs to recognize the way in which the lived life of the community and the norms to which it ascribes expresses a kind of narrative of that community. And I think that there is a way in which the kibbutz movement didn't recognize how serious that was. And therefore, the attempt to somehow constitute community based on some idea, and only an idea, which existed at the highest level of every single person giving according to their ability and getting according to their need, and some kind of socio-economic structure and belief, and all of community was going to be predicated upon certain ideas. So that, I think, failed in the same way that Rosenzweig, and this is Rosenzweig's critique of Reform Judaism, said that Reform Judaism has tried to create Judaism based on the principles of the prophets without understanding, no, Judaism is much richer than 5 or 6 or 10 ideas that it's committed to.
It's funny because I take a completely different perspective to Dahlia, as we are
Good,
yin and
finally,
yang
we
today.
disagree about something.
We complement each other, but more than usual, I think. My concern is that, the great emphasis that you put on the halakha as a legal code and the constitution of community and all these practical aspects of the halakha, which is in a way the title of your book, right? Don't you run the risk of throwing away the baby with the bathwater, in the sense that the divine here plays a second fiddle, and there you maybe risk alienating or pissing off your religious readers, of saying, how can you say that, the divine is and should be the central thing here?
And by the way, just to set the record straight, we were both struck by this passage in your book, where you say that the divine is not really the central focus of halakha, and it's not there as much as law itself.
If it's available to you, please quote me that passage, because I'm not sure which one you're referring to. But here's what I would say. I will be very pleasantly surprised if that's the experience that people have who read my book, who are very familiar with halakha. I think actually what's going to happen is that the part of the book that will be difficult for them is the 4th chapter, which is theological.
That's what I meant. You said that halakha does not deal much with theology.
Yes. Okay.
That's
correct.
what I was referring to.
Right. And so what I meant by that is that traditionally speaking, Jews who are halakhically observant can live their entire lives on a daily basis, and maybe their entire lives, without asking and confronting deep theological questions, because they are able to so focus on and separate the praxis from larger theological issues. There's a famous passage in which, in the Babylonian Talmud, in which the rabbis tell God that God has no play in the Beit Midrash, no say in the Beit Midrash.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Look at me like I was crazy.
And it's quoted left and right by people from outside of Orthodox circles and inside Orthodox halachic circles, in order to show that, yes, that's right, the halakha is a kind of human system based on some initial, far away divine getting it going. And then it's a kind of self-contained system which is operated according to legal principles and run by halachic authorities. And my claim in the 4th chapter is that that is a real disservice to what the halachic life is about.
Okay. We have to wrap up soon, but I want to start to end on a question that has to do with partly your personal journey, and also I think relates back to David Hartman's book, The Living Covenant, which I always think of as, I can't claim to remember every piece of it, but I always keep it in mind as a way of thinking about Judaism and its role in my life as a secular person, and the flexibility of it and the interpretation of it and the personal experience. And you talk about how your Orthodox Judaism is heavily guided by a need for egalitarian thinking between men and women. What is that like, trying to reconcile that with the Orthodox Jewish world?
So first I have to say that I don't consider myself part of Orthodox Judaism.
Okay,
no,
sorry.
that's okay. It's just that we all live in labels, and so sometimes we fight them, and so that one's one that I don't wear.
Fair. So how do you define yourself, by the way? Fine. That's fine too. That's good too.
What I tell my students is I say I'm open to any question you have about how I live my life, but don't ask me to give labels.
No, but is it fair to say that much of your work and much of your professional life is within the Orthodox Jewish community?
I would say I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
I stand corrected.
That's okay. I didn't mean to correct you. I just meant to say that, number one, in terms of what you mentioned about David Hartman's book, A Living Covenant, so you're right. He would often orally say that I didn't call my book The Living Covenant, I called it A Living Covenant, right? Because he really wanted to say, I'm not giving you the only possible interpretation of Judaism. I'm giving you a compelling interpretation of Judaism, a possibility.
Which is brilliant if you think about it.
And so I think that that's right, and I think that he succeeds in doing that. All I can say is that I think that in terms of the question of egalitarianism, is that I think that if we're honest, I think that maybe if we're already quoting Hartman, so I'll quote his last book, the title of his last book, The God Who Hates Lies. And I think that the soundtrack, the title track of that book comes from an essay in which he tells a story which up until then I had heard him tell but never see him commit to writing, that as a congregational rabbi in Montreal, he did what is explicitly forbidden by the Halakha, and that is to marry a Kohen and a divorcee. And he explains why he did that. And what I would say is that there's a way in which what he modeled for me as a teacher is what it is to struggle and what it is to try to live one's life authentically and to put oneself out there and to risk living the way that you think you are being called to or commanded to live, even if that stands at odds with regnant Jewish practice.
All right, Leon Wiener Dow, thank you very much for coming on the show and discussing your new book, The Going, a Meditation on Jewish Law, that just came out by Palgrave Macmillan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
And most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we have a special request for you. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then write one.
And a quick note before we end the show. I will be joining Thomas Erdbrink of the New York Times, he's the Tehran correspondent, and a range of other experts in March for a weekend of discussion on the Middle East in the wonderful surroundings of Weston Park, a stately British home. The event takes place between Friday, March 23rd to Sunday, March 25th, and it is being organized by UK travel specialists Political Tours. I'll be discussing Israel-Iranian relations with Thomas Erdbrink. We'll be joined by Nicholas Blandford, the Beirut-based writer who is widely acknowledged as one of the leading experts on Hezbollah. And beyond the Middle East speakers, we will discuss North Korea and the foreign policy vacuum in Washington. The weekend includes 2 nights stay, all meals, and complete use of the house, which has previously served as the venue for the Northern Ireland peace talks and a G8 summit. If you'd like more details, please visit www.politicaltours.com or email info@politicaltours.com.
Also, big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. Also, many thanks to Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Ramey Foundation for their support. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts for you and loads of other things. Check out our archive with more than 400 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and annoyed. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
Shalom.